Alright, some random bits about modifying your keyframes. So, I'm going to set this back to something more reasonable, like 40. And we're just going to go through and maybe say I want to move some of these around. So first of all, maybe you set a keyframe and you decide you don't actually want that keyframe. So in this case, like, say I hate frame 20, it looks terrible. If you want to delete that, you can right-click on that keyframe and just do delete. It's going to get rid of that keyframe. And notice it leaves all of the other keyframes there, it's just gotten rid of whatever was keyed on frame 20. We go ahead and undo that. You can also, if you need to, shift your keyframes around. So if you hold down the shift key and then click on your keyframe, it'll highlight that frame red, at which point you can pretty much just grab the keyframe and just left mouse button, click it, and drag it around wherever you need it. So now it's at frame 27 instead of frame 20. And if you need to, you can also do this with a range of keyframes. So if I press and hold shift, click, and then just drag without releasing my mouse button, it'll highlight multiple frames at once. If you need to move these around, you need to use these little arrows in the middle of whatever blob of frames you've selected, and just use and drag it around that way. If you try to just sort of click on a keyframe, it's going to just unhighlight whatever you've selected. So that's usually how I move keyframes around, fairly straightforward. So say maybe I'm going to swap whatever frame 30 was with whatever frame 20 was, and now they're sort of reversed. So that is usually how I move keyframes. There is one thing that you can do, and I don't necessarily recommend doing it, because it's frankly just annoying, I think. But I'm going to hold down shift, left mouse button, click and drag. You can actually scale your animations if you need to. So these outer little things here will scale it. You'll notice that it's sort of stretching that frame range. And the reason that I don't recommend doing this, so if I go to frame 11, you'll notice that my keyframe is no longer at the beginning of the frame, it is just sort of at frame like 11.2 or something weird. So you get these keyframes that are just like in the middle of frames, and you can still move them around. You can still delete them. It's just awkward. It makes it a little bit harder to modify, I think. You'll also notice that if I, like, move this over here and set... Oh, it's auto-keyed, so it's already keyed it. But you'll notice that I can have two keyframes on the same frame, which is really weird. And that's kind of where it gets, like, really hard to modify stuff, because you're just like, why is there two keyframes? And at this point, it makes this, like, really weird jump. Because on frame 11, it's kind of looking at the beginning of that animation, and then at frame 12, it's looking at the keyframe 0.2 frames later, and there's no real nice, smooth movement between them, and it's just gross, so I usually avoid scaling animations where possible, and which is pretty much all the time, honestly. I will go so far as to manually shift bunches of keys around so I don't need to scale things. So that's pretty much that. If you need to, you can also just grab a range of keyframes and do delete, and just delete whole chunks of animation at a time. The other thing you can do if you want to delete all keyframes on an object is, and you can do this for individual attributes. I'm just going to say maybe I don't want the translation key, that was a mistake. Right click and do break connections. And you can see that it's actually removed all of those little bars indicating that there's a keyframe. So now if I go through my animation, instead of having the sphere sort of fly throughout space, it's just hanging out where it was, and the only things being changed are the rotation and the scale. So you can also do this, again, with as many or as few attributes as you want. It doesn't super matter. One thing to know, and it's not terribly important, but wherever your object is, so like if I'm on frame 4 when I delete these keyframes, in this case frame 2, your object is going to stay where it is whenever you delete those keyframes. So if I go move my stuff around now, the object is staying wherever it was at frame 2. If I undo that previous modification and go to maybe, say, frame 34, and then again break the connections on those objects, you can see that the sphere is now staying where it was at frame 34. Functionally, I've never found this to cause, to cause a lot of issues. It's just, again, something to be aware of. Something I very messed up with the scale of this object. But that's more or less how I modify keyframes within the time slider. In the next video, I will be doing something. I'm indecisive about order, so tune into the next video to figure out what I've decided to show you guys. Ha ha ha.